everyone, and welcome back to the Social Work Bubble podcast. I'm your host, Laura. I'm a licensed master social worker here in New York. And today we welcome a special guest, Nechoma Eckhaus, also an LMSW. Thank you, Nechoma, for coming on today.
Thank you so much for having me, and so nice to finally meet you, Laura.
Yes, excited. Today we'll be getting into a lot of really, I think, important and interesting things about therapists having their own therapist, really honoring and prioritizing our own mental health needs. But before we get into that, for those listening, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, do all that fun stuff. Now, Nechoma, do you want to introduce yourself to the listeners real quick?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Well, just pretty simply about me, I simply got my LMSW almost a year ago, working towards becoming an LCSW, and my goal is to hopefully be able to build a practice where I can help people be able to live their authentic selves, be able to feel empowered in themselves, and to really just be able to make their mental health a priority. And I think that a little more than that, one of my big goals and one of my more recent goals is really making sure I do that myself as well. And I think that's something that I wouldn't want to say is not commonly spoken about, because I feel like these days so many stuff are being spoken about, but a lot of things I feel aren't necessarily being taken seriously if that's or acted upon, especially when it comes to therapists. So I think that that's something that a lot of us definitely, could feel more like it should be more normalized and more spoken about, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. I think you're right too, that I think in some ways it is spoken about, but it's not really taken seriously, or like no action is actually being taken. Like it's kind of like, yeah, we know mental health is important, self-care, like all this stuff, but then we don't actually do the things that we need to do in order to see that happen.
I think we can safely say we're kind of like, we're pretty good at telling other people to do it. We're pretty good at helping our clients do it. And I think we could say, it's becoming more common to say, hey, yeah, we also have to do it ourselves. But I think there's a simple part of reality that we could say it's unspoken about, because it's spoken about, but it's not actually, I don't think it's really recognized by a lot of people, and a lot of therapists might not even always remember it themselves. We may be therapists, but we're humans also. And we may have skill, we may be experienced, we know how to, help our clients with a lot of different things. We may have the answers like spit back. We can tell them exactly what it is that, we can help them with. But how many of us can even come down and tell ourselves that we know the answers ourselves? Or why should we even be expected to know the answer ourselves?
Absolutely. That's so interesting too, because I've gone to a therapist before. I'm not currently seeing one, but I remember when I first started in the field too, I was in supervision, and I had a moment where I was like, this would be a good time to probably let my supervisor know that like I'm struggling with something, or, like I'm seeing a therapist outside of work for these different reasons. And there was such this internal block inside of me where I'm like, no, I can't do that, because there will be judgment, or like I'll be looked at as like weak or not a good enough therapist. Like, oh my gosh, how can Laura be a therapist when she's seeing her own? Like all this internalized stuff I didn't realize was even there for me after I'm just like, love mental health. Mental health is so important. But then I had all this stuff come up for myself.
It's so hard to be able to to have to endure that type of thing internally while we're just trying to be able to do our thing. We're trying to be there for other people. And I think that's why they say we're some of the most difficult clients, because we know exactly what it's like to be on the other side of the desk. We know how, perhaps depending on what settings you've worked in, we know what it feels to work like in an agency where there's so many other people involved, where, we know what it's like to be either in a private practice or to be in an agency with other therapists involved. And we know what it's like to what our clients are going through. We might not be the most comfortable disclosing stuff about ourselves to others. But I think that the biggest thing here, and I think it's even more important for therapists in general, is that even though we may be good at what we do, I don't think any amount of skill, experience, anything makes us immune to mental health problems. We could be suffering with anxiety, depression, other mental health issues, just like our clients are. And it's not only so much harder to recognize those things and take a step back and realize we need that. It's hard to be able to say, as you said, to go out and get that help. And something that, you mentioned, about personal preference here. I don't think the goal here is to say that everyone has to have a therapist and that's what's
Right.
needed here. But I feel like it should be made normal that we're
Hmm.
humans the same way our clients are. And I personally have no shame in saying that I was recently with my therapist and we were working through something I was dealing with internally. And my
Hmm.
therapist said, not in a condescending way, she said in a very honest, down to earth way, yeah, you know what has to be done, like to be able to fix this, right? Like, you know what has to be done. And I literally sat there stumped. Like, it's
Hmm.
something that for one of my clients, I could say it in my sleep. I could say it with the
Yeah.
back of my hand. And it's like, for myself, it's like, well, what am I supposed to do now? Like,
Yeah. Absolutely. That's so interesting because I had a very similar experience with my most recent therapist, who I'm not seeing anymore. But
mhm,
it was it just became, and I think this is also potentially an issue with therapists going to therapy, is
mhm.
my own therapist only ever saw me as another therapist and almost like as a colleague instead of a
Oh, wow.
client.
Yeah.
And so there were moments when like I was obviously in session, like I needed some support, I needed some guidance or something, and kind of a similar energy was there where it's like, well, you know what to do, or like, what would you tell a client, or like all this, and I'm like, that's not what I'm here for. If I
Exactly.
wanted to walk through that, I'd talk to my supervisor about it, but I'm here for therapy, not to have like a consult right now.
Exactly. And, from that personal experience, I mentioned that's what they were telling me. I knew that she wasn't saying it out of a place of, yeah, you know exactly what
Yeah.
to do. I think it was more in an obvious way, like, what do you need it? What step do you have to take to deal
Hmm.
with what's in order to be able to heal from what you're dealing with? And
Yeah.
at the same time, I was like, this definitely looks good. Like, I should know, like, why, like, and I'm like, no, right now I need you to tell me, I need you to
Hmm.
help me out with this. And I think becoming more and more comfortable with that and making that this time, me having a therapist separate from my supervisor, separate from my work. Sure, maybe questions come up, hey, how's work going? Or like, suggestions here
Right.
and there because we always like to, give our therapist our progress and share with them our milestones. But something completely separate because I'm making a point of prioritizing me. I think that that's something that it's so easy for us to get lost in that. We all have lives. We all work. We're all busy. Um, and we're all spending a very, significant amount of time working with other clients that
Hmm.
this often gets lost. And we're not necessarily, being able to take that minute for us and saying, hey, this is what, we need to do for ourselves. And I
Hmm.
think that even after we say, hey, I'm actually learning to take care of myself, there's a lot that has to be done before you can actually say that.
Oh
I
yeah,
learned that pretty quickly.
absolutely. What all was entailed in that?
Well, pretty simply enough, last year when I finished
Mm.
school, I was like telling a group of people that, I feel like one of the biggest things is I've learned to take time for myself. It took me an entire year to really take that seriously. Things got
Yeah.
so busy. Things got so, working in new agencies, working, getting my licensure and really
Hmm.
just being able to keep up with life that I realized, hang on a second, I'm reaching my point where I can't really be anything to anyone else if I keep going like this. I need to start making time for myself. I need to acknowledge to myself that it's okay that I have these needs. I tell clients on a regular basis this.
Hmm.
Like why should I be any different? And I think that only in the last few months personally, I've been able to start taking that seriously, giving
Yeah.
myself a day off when needed, when I could, seeing my therapist as off whenever I could,
Hmm.
whenever that could be arranged. Being able to say, yeah, I need some time alone to myself away from my responsibilities, however that means for each person. I think that that's finally something that I'm actually taking seriously. To the point
Hmm.
where yesterday someone asked, how's work going? And I said, very busy and stuff. The busiest thing I'm in the middle of, and I had no pun intended, was I'm making it a real point to work on myself and work on making sure I'm being taken care of. And it's a
Yeah.
work in progress.
Hmm.
So that was something that was my initial response and I felt pretty good about it. So I think
Yeah.
that if anything could come out of this episode, I think that we could make the difference between, therapists in their professional role and therapists taking care of themselves as people because
Hmm.
we have no problem helping every client with that. I think that we can very well do that and should, more
Yeah.
importantly, do that for ourselves if we want to be able to be anything for our clients.
Hmm. Absolutely. That also, I think, really extends. into just having those big boundaries and knowing what you need outside of work. Because I think so often, like just as much as my therapist saw me as another therapist, like so many people in my life view me in that same way, where it's like, oh, okay, this is your job. Let me just call Laura up and ask her for some advice on this. Or like, oh, I have a friend who's struggling with this. Like, what would you recommend? Like also getting out of that role and setting those boundaries with other people in my life. Like similar to you, work in progress, but it's gotten so much better where
That's awesome.
I'm kind of like, all right, I can't do this. I have a full caseload. I can't be monitoring everyone else in my personal life too to see what's going on.
Absolutely. I like that, making that boundary, because, I've heard a lot lately about this whole thing, like your close friend is not your friends are not your therapist type
Yeah.
of thing, even though, you can have great relationships and talk the deepest stuff with them and hear, vulnerable things from them. There's a huge difference between that and being able to make sure you're being taken care of emotionally yourself. And, it's great to have that. Very happy for anyone, who can have a friend like that, but it's different than being able to properly,
Mm-hmm.
connect with a therapist and be able to address what you're dealing with personally. And I think there's no
Mm-hmm.
shame in doing that. I think there should be absolutely no shame. In fact, it should be more, I'm not here to mandate it, and I'm not here to say, yeah, look guys, therapy for everybody, Mondays at
Right.
6. Like, I think that I would encourage it, because I think that for each person, based on their preference, what works for them, some people, thrive off of weekly, some need it once a month, some just
Mm-hmm.
whenever they need it, some, every now and then, and evaluating that, seeing what works for you, seeing what you're dealing with at the time. You might need it for longer.
Mm-hmm.
Might not necessarily need it this day. I think that paying attention to your needs and your specific emotions outside of your work, outside of your goals,
Mm-hmm.
outside of whatever you might be. You could be a successful therapist with a huge practice and still be struggling internally.
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with that. It doesn't reflect on your job, your professionalism, your ability to be a therapist. I think the only thing it does reflect on is it can be very hard for you to do your job
Mm-hmm.
if you don't give that to yourself first. So that's why I
Absolutely.
personally value it.
Yeah, that's huge. It's so, I mean, for such a long time too, because of that internalized, like those barriers that I had up, I tried to be my own therapist, which is wild because it kind of goes into that same idea, like you're saying, like, okay, well, I should know what I need, like I should know what to do. And so when I first started going to therapy, it was for PTSD. And so I was like, okay, I work with trauma. I know how to deal with this. Let me just exposure therapy my way out of this so I don't have to go to anyone, which obviously just re-traumatizes someone. Like that's not how you do it. And it took me a few years to actually get to the point where I'm like, it's really time for me to go to a therapist. I'm wondering, in your own experience, what was your journey like to actually get to therapy? Like, did you have any barriers up yourself, or was it like pretty open from the start?
I most definitely had barriers because it's the first time, and I don't really have a problem sharing this. As a teenager, it's something that, my parents thought I could make use of, which I definitely could
Hmm.
have. But I think having the right therapist and having a good therapist is
Oh
a
yeah.
game changer. And I unfortunately was not that lucky at the beginning of the
Hmm.
game, so it turned me off pretty quickly. But maybe a year later, when I was like 16, maybe 17, I don't
Yeah.
even know. I don't even remember when it was. I felt that stuff internally weren't doing well. I knew I wasn't happy on the inside. And that's when I went to my parents and said, look, I need to talk to someone. And their initial reaction was panic. I had to assure them, guys, no one hurt me. Like, I'm safe. It's all good. I just need someone who
Hmm.
can objectively listen to me and not judge and be able to understand and validate my feelings. I think that
Hmm.
that was the first thing. And from there, that's my therapist that I have till today. And I
Wow.
think that from there and being able to pick up on it whenever it was needed has
Hmm.
been extremely helpful. And I've reached points in my life where things have happened and I've tried my best to, to get through it, to,
Hmm.
be able to, do whatever I can to get through things without needing that help, or at times where I wasn't necessarily able to access it or able to afford it and
Hmm.
stuff like that, however it plays out for each person. I've reached points where I said, I can't do this anymore. I
Yeah.
need help. And I think that that's something that I personally reached on my own, and I'm not making myself, I don't think that makes me any better than anyone else, but it's
Hmm.
a very hard point to reach, Laura. I think that it's something that people don't want to acknowledge. Like I
Yeah.
know plenty of people who say, yeah, they're not having it easy, but I have the tools and I should be able to do
Hmm.
it. And like there's nothing wrong with having a therapist. Like I'm not going to scream it to the world and I'm not going to force that on them, but it's like,
Hmm.
there's really nothing wrong
Yeah.
with getting that help. I think that that's something that just really has to be made normalized. And
Hmm.
there's no shame in anyone, anyone who's not a therapist, anyone who is a therapist, whatever title, whatever type of person, whatever you see yourself in life. Mental health doesn't, mental health isn't necessarily nice to all of us.
Yeah.
And we're not all lucky to be able
Hmm.
to, excuse me, get through life without having those type of things get in the way. And I think that being in tune with yourself, being able to know when there's stuff troubling you, when you feel like you can't deal with it yourself. The biggest step you can do for yourself and to be taking care of yourself and to perhaps be there for other people,
Yeah.
if you're in the position of doing that, is acknowledging that you might need help and
Hmm.
that it's okay to get that help.
Yeah. Absolutely. Because then you're not showing up as this version of yourself that other people need, that you yourself need to function as a just regular person every single day, if you just ignore that there's a problem. And that's, again, like something we say to clients so easily, like, it's so important. So glad you're like here, like all of this stuff, but we don't bring that same energy to ourselves.
It's very difficult to, as on for one reason, not doing that because of not doing that, but also just, not even realizing that that's what's needed.
Yeah.
Like not being able to understand that, okay, just like I'm telling my client, like, it's okay for you to take a few minutes to yourself. Let's set that boundary together. Like you have the right to say no. How many of us actually do that on an
Mm.
honest reality? And of course, even if we have figured out how to do that, there's always points where things happen, things get in the way. I don't like to use the term a weak moment because I don't
Mm.
think that that's really a reflection of, you know, what it is. But
Right.
having points where, things can get emotionally intense. Things can
Hmm.
get hard to deal with in the moment. And we might not be equipped in that second to be like, to implement that tool, even if we have
Hmm.
it. So I think that just constantly nurturing it,
Yeah.
constantly giving yourself what you need to be able to be your best self, to feel your best self.
Hmm.
Because as much as you have a responsibility as a therapist, you're there for other people. The first thing that you should be responsible for is you.
Hmm.
You can't do anything else. How could you be expected to be a clinician, to be a therapist, to be
Yeah.
helping people, to be professional around other people
Hmm.
if you're not there for yourself first?
Yeah. Absolutely. That was, I mean, really huge too, I think, when I first started therapy, was also just getting that experience as a client. And I think that really changed my own approach as a therapist in many ways, where I'm just like, oh, this is how it feels. Like, this is so vulnerable and so, like, it brought up so much for me, where now I think I also, again, you should not go to therapy just because it'll benefit your clients. Obviously,
Oh,
do it
of
for
course not.
yourself, but it really just changed for the better, like how I operate as a therapist, and me being able to also, I think, frame things and really relate to clients in a way. And I've also gotten oddly better at self-disclosure, which I used to be so anti self-disclosure, where
It's
I'm just
such
like,
a hard, sensitive
it's
topic.
so inappropriate. I could never do that. Like that, like all this. And now, like when I was working with teens, I had a teenager ask me, do you see a therapist? And I was like, yeah, I do. And she was like, oh, that's so cool. And I'm like,
Love that.
yeah. And that was a moment too where I think it proved to her that I was like meaning what I was talking about. Not again, like not that you have to go to a therapist to prove that you practice what you preach, but that was such a meaningful moment for this particular client to be like, oh, she gets it. That's cool.
Most times I feel that clients any teenagers that I've worked with in the last 2 years, if they've asked something like that, or have you ever experienced this or that,
Hmm.
I feel like for a lot of them, and they've actually told me this too, most of them aren't really looking for the specific answer. Like
Yeah.
I don't think it matters to them whether or not we have, but they're like, do you get me? Like, do you
Hmm.
know what this is? Like, are you just like, talking,
Yeah.
talking, or are you actually, do you mean it? And
Hmm.
I think it's made major difference to not only be able to be there for ourselves more, but it helps us understand our
Oh
clients more.
yeah. Absolutely. Because there's also been things, I do a lot of like CBT in the therapy that I do. So there can be a lot of like homework or like stuff like that. And it's honestly been through my experience, my personal experience, rather than like my education or schooling or anything, that's really told me what's realistic for people. Like what actually
For
makes sense
sure.
in the therapy room versus in a textbook.
I think that that's something that they don't really tell us, and
Hmm.
most professors didn't even like bother saying, as well as in internships, that there's all this protocol we're expected to follow and all these things, which, they definitely do. There's a reason why they're teaching it to us, but how much of it
Hmm.
actually realistically comes down to inside the room with your
Yeah,
client?
absolutely.
I agree wholeheartedly on that because I think that, um, it's painted in a way that it's very specific, and which it is. There's
Hmm.
parts of this profession that have, there's many different parts of social work and as clinicians, as you know,
Hmm.
um, but it's very hard to like separate the textbook
Yeah.
from the moment in front of us. And sometimes, you know, a certain form of conversation or a certain, type of intervention is what the client needs and what's
Mhm.
appropriate for that moment, as opposed to all these different theories and all these different things, even though they do
Yeah.
play a significant role.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Something interesting too, I think you kind of touched on it a little earlier, was
Mm-hmm.
just having a therapist different than talking to your clinical supervisor,
Completely different.
which is so important.
It's huge
Mhm.
because, um, depending on where you work and stuff, your clinical supervisor, for the most part, of course, as time goes on, you get more comfortable with them.
Right.
They might know more about your personal life, but like they're mainly there to, especially if you're starting a new job,
Hmm.
how's it going? What can we help you with? Okay, should we review this? Did you have any questions for me? Like reviewing specific cases, any questions that you had about a client, what method should you
Yeah.
use? I don't think you're going to this supervisor being like, I've been dealing with so much anxiety and I'm really not sure how to handle this argument and I'm just so lost that I feel like I'm
Hmm.
breaking on the inside. Like I don't think any of us are reaching a point where we're going to be that vulnerable with a
Yeah.
colleague, like
Hmm.
with a work colleague who's superior to you. And
Yeah.
I think that there's a certain mode of professionalism that's expected. Of course that there's room for like, hey, is there anything you need help in? Any way I could support you?
Hmm.
Hey, I might be feeling a bit like this. But I feel like that's completely separate than
Yeah.
going into your therapist's office. And that's why I make it a point. Anytime I walk into my therapist's office, it is such a different, I'm actually going later today.
Hmm.
It's such a different like thing where I sit down and it's like, I've needed this so badly.
Yeah.
Like I'm on the opposite side of the room. I'm the client here. I could feel however I need to. And obviously that's usually when my emotions are not the nicest too. So I
Yeah.
guess that's what, that's how it should be. And
Hmm.
that's what it needs to be.
Yeah, absolutely. It's also just, I think, a good professional boundary to have because I'm also
Of
thinking
course.
I'm not a supervisor yet, but I imagine that's not my job, like if they have their own caseload on their own, I'm sure it's already hard to manage people, to supervise people, like taking on that role as
Sure.
a therapist for someone that is a colleague, even if they're under you. I mean, that's really tough. And there have been moments too when, maybe I disclose to my supervisor, I've been struggling with this. This is maybe how it's affecting my work. Because
Of
there was, I think, a
course.
period where I got really behind on my progress notes
Wow.
and it was rough.
We love
And
our
so
notes.
we had a conversation and I was very honest. I was like, this is obviously not an excuse, but this is what I've been dealing with. And he was very understanding and I think it provided some helpful context, but that also was not on him to therapize me in that moment.
Of
He
course.
still did his job as a supervisor to offer support, to strategize on what I needed so I could continue to show up as a professional. But then I would go see my therapist so we could talk about, okay, what do I need for my mental health? And those are two very different supports that looked very different, but were both important.
I think though that actually played the way you described it, that actually is a very good example of how it should be. because it's very common, you know, to show up at work and stuff aren't necessarily playing out in your personal life, but
Yeah.
without disclosing too much personal information that it's
Mm-hmm.
impacting, you know, your current role in this specific job or whatever, you know, wherever you found yourself. And
Yeah.
your supervisor's response in saying, oh, so let's see, how can we support you in that?
Mm-hmm.
Different from how a therapist would do, and different in
Absolutely.
a way that it was kept professional, it was kept respectful,
Mm-hmm.
and whatever had to be done to be taken care of, for you to be able to take care of yourself and do whatever you needed for yourself is
Mm-hmm.
huge. And it's just sad that a lot from what I've been seeing, that's not really taken into account. It's not recognized
Mm-hmm.
among a lot of therapists. And I think that that needs to be recognized, that we're different from, we're not any different from who our clients are,
Yeah.
aside from, you know, our job,
Mm-hmm.
which, you know, we're in the position of being there for them in a therapist role and they're there
Mm-hmm.
in the client's role. But sometimes we're clients too, and
Yeah.
there's a place for that. There's actually a need for that. And that as much as, you know, we have experience, we could be great therapists at the end of the day. We could be very successful in what we do. We could have
Mm-hmm.
helped thousands of clients throughout our day, but we're not superhuman.
Yeah.
No one is. And no
Mm-hmm.
one should be expected to no one should be expected to be able to do those things. The same way our clients need help with stuff and
Yeah.
they shouldn't be expected to endure things alone. Why should we?
Mm-hmm.
There's no reason why we should be expected to do that, and that there's no way we can
Yeah.
do that all alone. It would be very, I find it would be very impossible to be able to function emotionally and
Mm-hmm.
be able to go about our regular life and then do our job at the end of that
Yeah.
and have a full caseload at the end of that.
Wild. Yeah. It is. It's
Eventually it
something.
catches up and eventually it catches up and is not possible.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I've noticed too, I think that also plays into like some client expectations where I've had to almost like educate clients a little bit on what to expect from me. So, cause
Exactly.
like I'm not in a role where I'm available 24/7. That's not my job. These are some resources you can utilize, hotline numbers, this and that. But that's just not, it's a very dependent relationship with a therapist, which is a
Of
whole other
course.
thing. But
Boundaries 2.0.
yeah, where so much of what I do is like clients come in with a certain expectation, or maybe they had an experience with a therapist prior where that kind of set the tone. And so I kind of had to be the one to come in and be like, nah,
Yeah.
this is
No.
how it works here. Like, this is what I need. This is what is also just good for the therapeutic relationship. And for some clients, I think there was some pushback, especially when maybe they were used to having access to a therapist anytime that they needed.
At
But
12 o'clock at night on a
yeah,
weekend.
and I'm like, I'm not answering your email. Like, this is my weekend. What's going on? And I think that also just helped clients understand though, like, oh, boundaries are important, and we can't, we can't just expect someone to give so much of themselves all the time with no boundaries just because I'm a client, and that also helps them
Right.
understand how to function on their own and not have like any codependence.
To be able to, you know, if they find themselves, you know, just very emotionally distraught or desperate in that moment when
Mm-hmm.
it's like completely out of office, to come up with, to have a game plan, grounding techniques,
Yeah.
something that they can have. And obviously, you know, for each clinician, it's different. For each person, for each therapeutic relationship, it's a matter of their boundaries and their preferences. But of course, if there's an emergency, if there's something
Mm-hmm.
specific, you know, there's always room to talk about that.
Yeah.
But I think that having your preference of boundaries, not only it sets the tone for your practice, but it also makes it clear that you're giving yourself your time and you don't take work home with you.
Mm-hmm.
Because all consuming throughout your whole day could
Yeah.
like not only take up so much headspace, but it can prevent you
Mm-hmm.
from doing it, like going about your day, from enjoying
Yeah.
yourself and having, you know, being able to tend to your own health.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I feel like so much of this too, at least I think in my own journey, ties a lot into perfectionism and that same idea of like being superhuman, where I think we're told from very early on that we're going to have super high caseloads. You're going to be super stressed. You're not going to get paid well. You're going to like have all these cons to the profession. And
There's
it's
quite a
just,
bunch of them.
yeah. And it's just normalized from the jump. And then, I don't know, when you're actually in the field and you're impacted by all of these things, like I started to question, like, is this even for me? Like I was told this is what I should expect, and that I should like get okay with that.
Oh,
And
God.
all of this like perfectionism and like superhuman stuff that I internalized was telling me like, oh no, I'm not good enough to be here anymore after just like a year post grad in the field. And I feel like, I mean, again, it just plays into that toxic mentality that we're supposed to show up regardless, 100%, always be on top of it, deal with all these little fires we have to put out, and also just deal with, I mean, just the job itself is hard and it's emotionally exhausting. Even if it's not working with a super high risk or intense client, you're still being vulnerable and emotional yourself in these spaces and moments. And
Definitely.
it's like, what the heck are we supposed to do?
I think it's also a boundary like that most people aren't comfortable talking about,
Mm-hmm.
should be, more normalized here. When you mentioned before, like, um, going into this field, like, oh, you should be prepared to take care of all this. And then
Yeah.
comes your again, then comes something completely unrelated, and, you might be feeling uncomfortable yourself. And then there's that one person who says, well, you're a therapist. You should know this. And also you should be comfortable talking about this.
Mm-hmm.
Like you should be fine with, addressing this. It's like, no, no, no. This is my personal life.
Yeah.
I may be a therapist and I do well helping other people, but this is not relevant to that. This does
Mm-hmm.
not reflect my ability as a therapist, and I could choose to reflect on myself
Yeah.
without you forcing me to talk about something I don't want to. Like
Mm-hmm.
that's like I think that's a completely different thing that so many people who aren't therapists use that as a way as like, hey, you're a therapist.
100%.
You should be able to handle this. You should know that you got into this field. You should know what you got into.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we know what we got into, but we're humans too. And I think that we have to
Absolutely.
make that difference.
Yeah. It reminds me of, I went to get my hair cut one time,
Mm-hmm.
and rule number one that I have since established for myself is I now don't tell people that I'm a therapist when I'm out getting my hair cut, because I was just getting a couple inches trimmed, and the hairdresser knew my sister, and my sister had told her, oh, she's like home for the weekend, she lives in New York, she's a
Mm-hmm.
therapist, all this stuff, so she already knew.
Oh God.
And the appointment, which should have only taken like 45 minutes, turned into 3 hours.
Wow.
And this was a point when like I was not good at setting boundaries, and you're kind of in a very difficult position of being stuck in a chair at a hairdresser's
How to
place.
end it, how to properly get yourself out of that.
Right. And so, I
Oh,
mean, she's asking me all of like 10 million questions about social work, about being a therapist,
oh God.
things like about criminal minds. And then at the time, I think I was an undergrad, so I was working with a lot of kids that had been sexually abused and trafficked. She was
Wow.
asking me questions about that, and I'm like, this is a Saturday afternoon.
It's like, what else do you know about me?
Right. I'm like, this is wild. And I walked out of there. I'm like, that was the most exhausting appointment I've ever had. Like, this was
3 whole
supposed to be,
hours.
yeah, it was supposed to be
Wow.
a chill time when I'm just like vibing, getting my hair cut. And it turned into such an exhausting moment where, of course, like, she was just, talking her head off, and she seemed very happy with the conversation. No
I'm sure she
idea
was.
that it was just like, no, this is my time off. Like, I don't want any part of this conversation right now.
Wow, I feel you on that, and the whole thing about not necessarily being great at setting boundaries, which I think
Hmm.
all of us are a work in progress for that, because
Yeah.
in the beginning, I feel each person may struggle with a different area of it, but for one, it could be wrapping up a session, ending a
Hmm.
conversation, avoiding certain topics, and
That's
it's
tough.
like, and before graduating and being in college, it's like, wait, so what do I do? But
Hmm.
like even that's like a real life situation, Laura, where you're just getting your hair cut, you're just relaxing on a weekend, and it's like, hang on, like, how do
Hmm.
I get out of here?
Yeah. It was
Wow.
wild, but that was an important lesson for me. Yeah. But it also shows too, I mean, in those moments, like you said, we're a work in progress, but that's why it's so important to learn and practice how to set those boundaries and how to communicate. I mean, it's a tough moment when, you're wrapped up in a hairdresser's chair. There's only so much
Yes.
you can do.
Literally
But
tied up.
yeah, but I mean, that was a huge learning moment for me where I'm like, okay, I have to be really mindful of like what I need and what I want because I'm like home visiting family for the weekend. I'm exhausted. At the time I was working in community mental health or like when I was working with kids. It was intense work that I was doing. And so that was my off time. That was my time. I didn't have to think about it. And I mean, I think I could have navigated it a little differently. Probably
Years
still
later,
had a hard time.
I love how like it happened and a while back it's like, God, I wish I handled that differently. I'm even thinking about that from clients I saw several months ago. It's like, I wish I said that, or I wish I was like,
Right.
you know what I mean? Like we always, it always comes where you might be second guessing a response, even like a simple gesture, if it's face to face,
Right.
or even like how you wrapped up a phone call, or like something like, it's like, it's so
Mhm.
common to like have that hesitation or that like, God, I wish I could have handled that differently. But I
Yeah.
feel like it's important that in those moments, that's the position that you were in and that
Mhm.
it doesn't reflect negatively. It only reflects, positively the fact that you're continuing to reflect, to build your skill, to learn, to be honest with yourself and
Mhm.
to set those boundaries firmly and respectfully when needed.
Yeah. True. It's a great way of saying that. Oh, wonderful. I wonder, I mean, outside of like boundaries, and I think just doing a lot of reflection, because that's what's helped me, especially prioritize my mental health and finally get to the point of like going to therapy when I needed it, was a lot of reflection and challenging myself and being honest with myself to be like, no, this is what we need and it's okay. Has there been anything else that's really helped you prioritize your mental health?
I was going to say being honest with myself, which
Mm-hmm.
I've always like I think that this is also something a common struggle because you can say from today to tomorrow, yeah, I'm honest with myself. Only in the last few months I've realized that hang on, I've got certain needs here, I've got certain
Mm-hmm.
feelings here that need to be here. But before that I didn't really, pay attention to that. So like we can say from today to tomorrow, yeah, we're gonna be honest, we're taking care of ourselves. Are we
Mm-hmm.
really? Like I think it's really important to keep on checking in with yourself and doing whatever that means. And
Mm-hmm.
for some like me, that means, being in therapy sometimes. For some, it means really giving yourself time off to
Yeah.
do those specific things. So I think it really comes down to each person individually. For myself, it took giving myself what I've given my clients,
Mm-hmm.
allowing myself to acknowledge that, hey, you have certain needs. There may be more that come up, plenty more
Yeah.
that come up along the way, and there's no use pushing those back.
Mm-hmm.
That's why, like, when I'm with my therapist, it's like, I'm completely different than how
Yeah.
I am.
Mm,
And of course, that's when emotions decide that they need to be
of
unleashed because you're
course.
in a safe place to do that. And you should
Yeah.
feel safe to be able to
Mm-hmm.
do that. The same way you provide that space with your client. Take as much
Mm-hmm.
time as you need. You can feel whatever you need to here without judging them.
Yeah.
We should not be afraid of anybody else judging us too. And that's why I think not only it's important to do that, but also
Mm-hmm.
making sure you have a therapist who's on the
Yeah.
same page like that, because it's very easy to get turned off by the idea by being
Mm-hmm.
with someone that isn't the right fit for you.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's very true. Because I stay with I mentioned this earlier. I'm not seeing them anymore because
Mm-hmm.
it was not a good fit. And I worked with them for far too long with it being a
Wow.
bad fit because, you know, I like to avoid conflict.
Mm-hmm. Longer
And
periods of time it's always harder when it's for longer. Like I have a
yeah.
client who has multiple different, like, clients who have different counselors or different providers and they
Mm-hmm.
said they've been with one for 4 years. And I'm like, that's an awfully long time. Like,
Yeah.
I'm hoping it's going well, like sort of thing. Like,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But that fit is so important because that really, I mean, sometimes that's why therapy became so important for me to go to, is because sometimes that would be the only space I had truly to myself, because especially when we not just are therapists, but we're friends, we're family members, like we just have so much responsibility and
of
things that we take
course,
on. It can be so important just to have that space, even if it's just 45 minutes every now and again,
I
just to
value
be,
that 45
yeah,
minutes more
it's
than you know.
huge. It's huge. Like it's a different kind of feeling to leave that space and know, like even if you like dove into hard stuff, you were able to just unleash it and get into it rather than just, go about being a support to everyone else.
Of course. I think
Um,
knowing that that space is so important to you, it makes you want to invest all the more in making
mhm,
sure you make use of it. Whether that means, you know, making sure it's a good time and ensuring your privacy, making a point of being there fully and disconnecting from everything else just for that 45 minutes or, under an hour time. I
mhm,
think that it becomes more and more valuable if
mhm,
it's something that important to you. If it's something that you need and you
mhm.
need to really address certain feelings, certain emotions, you just need to be able to feel safe, to feel good, to feel
Yeah.
lighter. I think it's all that more important to be able to utilize it and really properly, you know,
Mhm.
give it to yourself when needed.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was this Instagram post I
Mm-hmm.
had a little bit ago about like advocating for yourself as social workers, like in the field, advocating
Mm-hmm.
for your needs. And there had been someone that had reposted it at this bigger page, and there was a lot of social workers in the comments that were just like, well, tell that to my boss. And it was like this
Oh
very
God.
defeatist mentality, and it was very like, well, this is just how it is, nothing's going to change. And I think that's definitely how I operated when I first got into this field, which, I'm still very new to everything, but that's really shifted for me a lot, where I realized, no, we do have power. We can advocate for
Of course.
ourselves. We don't have to just live in this way that's like unfulfilling and draining and leading to burnout so quickly. And I saw some of these comments, and I'm like, if I just wish you knew that you didn't have to live this way.
It's so difficult because I can see where all those people a lot of those people might
Right.
be coming from because I'm pretty sure even in my own personal experience in internships and working,
Mhm.
there may be that one person above you supervising you that, might not be a great fit or might
Yeah.
not be validating of your feelings. There were so many months that I spent with my feelings pushed down, shut
Mhm.
down, and just being told by everyone, just do this with your head down,
Yeah.
get through it. I was fresh after becoming a mother.
Mhm.
I've already had more than enough on my plate. There, it could be very difficult. Like, and it's similar to most corporate jobs or any other job you find yourself if you're in an environment where you're not supported. And I wish people, like as you say, Laura, I wish people knew that you can
Mhm.
advocate and really be assertive about your own emotions, even if someone higher up isn't going to respect that or
Yeah.
appreciate that and shut down and help make you shut down for that. And there are so many instances where I wish I was more assertive, where I
Mhm.
was able to say, I don't appreciate the way you just spoke to me. I don't appreciate that you commented on that. I don't appreciate that you're not respecting my time when
Mhm.
I went home on the time that I was supposed to go home when you
Yeah.
expected me to stay a few more hours to see more clients when that's
Yeah.
not in the agreement. Like, you know what I mean? Like,
Absolutely.
I think it's so important for people to be able to, and it all comes in line with taking care of themselves in general,
Mhm.
is to, with any job, but specifically as a therapist, to know that you're a human being also, and you
Mhm.
deserve to be respected and treated as such.
Yeah. Absolutely. And that you can kind of use that voice before it gets to the point of burnout. Because I noticed like within myself so often, I would only be able to muster up that like courage to be assertive and to like and advocate for myself when it was really almost coming from this place of lashing out because I was frustrated, I was burnt out, I was like, I can't do this anymore. And so then I was using my voice when obviously shoulda, coulda, woulda, but like had I set the tone for that beforehand and been assertive from the jump or try to like lean into those boundaries, I wouldn't have had to get to that point of burnout potentially. Obviously, again, there are a lot of things working against us in this field. It depends on
Of
who your
course.
supervisor is. Like there can be insane expectations put on us, but we have a lot more power than we realize.
We definitely do. And I think the biggest power of that is, just recognizing your worth, recognizing
Mm-hmm.
that you're a person and recognizing that you can still be everything that you're hoping to be. You can still be that amazing counselor, that therapist, that clinician, whatever you want. You could even be a supervisor. You could
Yeah.
do all those things and at the same time take care of yourself and respect yourself first.
Mm-hmm.
Because that should be a thing. And I think that combined with, every therapist prioritizing themselves and also, maybe that means seeing a therapist. I think that all those things are so crucial for us to be able to do our job right. And that expands to any type of therapist out there,
Mm-hmm.
even if you're not even in the clinical field. I think it expands to every field in general, but I think we can safely say we're focusing on a specific thing here
Yeah.
that we can do that and we should.
Mm-hmm.
And
Absolutely.
that there always are those points where it does get complicated, where it can lead to potential burnout. Even, if you're happy with where you are and, you're doing well and you know how to speak for yourself, there are those days where I say, man, I wish I went into affiliate marketing and I can make 10K a month, which
There we
everyone's
go.
over about. There's always those things
Mm-hmm.
when the job like this, as you said, can get draining, doesn't pay as much as it should, unless you're in a specific field or private practice, etc.
Mm-hmm.
It could be so easy to get those moments of like, is this really for me? Am I capable of doing this? Even though you know on the inside that you are, even though
Yeah.
it's not always easzy to feel driven. Just yesterday,
Mm-hmm.
I was telling someone, I'm like, I feel pretty driven about things today.
Yeah.
But the other day I was like, man, this wasn't where I was.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And that's, I think, just part of being honest with ourselves, right? And recognizing we're not superhuman. We're going to have these days when it's just not feeling right. And that doesn't mean we have to just change professions, even though, I mean, that's always an option. But
It definitely is. And I know
yeah.
people who have, and
Mm-hmm.
that they worked hard and did everything they needed to, but decided, it got very intense. And I'm like, of course it got intense. You're working 40 hours a week. You have a full caseload. Like, yeah, do you have any time for yourself? Like, and when they told me that, hey, I graduated, but, I'm working at somewhere else right now, my words
Mm-hmm.
to them were, I'm so proud of you. Like, I'm
Yeah.
really happy that you're doing what you need for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And that, it's definitely an open option to go back to that soon.
Yeah.
It's not like it doesn't reflect badly on someone to invest all that into
Mm-hmm.
the degree of being a therapist and then deciding to take a break. There's so
Absolutely.
many people who become therapists later on in life. There's many
Mm-hmm.
people who leave the corporate field after 40 years of success and,
Yeah.
become something else. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that what matters is that each person is doing what they need
Yeah.
specifically for themselves and to take care of themselves. And I think that that's the only way that they can be
Mm-hmm.
anything to someone else.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, Nechoma, I feel like this has been such a helpful talk. I hope those listening will go to therapy now.
I definitely hope so too. That or find the way that works for them to take care
Mm-hmm.
of themselves. I think that, people hear the word therapy and it's like, we're definitely a lot more relaxed about it than more people would be.
Yeah.
But I think when people hear that word, it's like, bye. Like,
Mm-hmm.
it depends on who you are and everything, but it's not often that you find people that are very open about things. And it was funny that, it reached a point where I was with a group of friends and, while we used to be not the most comfortable with each other years ago, we've
Mm-hmm.
reached a point where we're just like, we're all talking about how much we pay our therapists and how often we go.
Love
And I'm like, guys,
it.
do you even realize what we're talking about? Like, that's how relaxed everybody was. And I think that
Mm-hmm.
it would be so helpful and it would be so changing for so many people if
Mm-hmm.
they were able to comfortably say, I deserve to take care of myself too. I
Yeah.
deserve to prioritize myself, my emotional well-being, my mental health with whatever that entails. And sometimes
Mm-hmm.
that means being a therapist. Sometimes that means, implementing any other type of self-care or therapeutic activity that
Yeah.
works for them, as long as they're making a point of prioritizing them and what they need for themselves.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, Nechoma, for those listening, can they continue to follow you somewhere so they can get more of this really helpful
They
talk?
definitely can. I recently started an Instagram page called The Gentle Practice.
Yay.
It's like between each word, the gentle and practice with a dot.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and yeah, we're more or less just being real on there.
Yeah.
We do plan to get into specific areas, specific topics, which all cater around the idea of teaching people how to be kind to themselves, teaching
Mm-hmm.
people how to prioritize themselves. And I guess it also comes down to the self-disclosure thing, and each person can choose for themselves what they want to share and what they don't.
Mm-hmm.
For anyone who knows me personally and people who don't, you may very well possibly see certain parts of me. You may see me being comfortable sharing certain things, and the only reason why I do is because I want people to know they're not alone in it, and I
Mm-hmm.
want people to be comfortable with being open about how they feel. And I
Yeah.
think that anything I would share would hopefully be somewhat helpful for at least one person.
Mm-hmm. That's huge. Well, that'll be linked below for any of those listening. Go and follow Nechoma. And if anything resonated with you, just like, share, comment, do what you got to do, and we will see you next time. Thank you so much, Nechoma.
Absolutely. Thank you again.